The smell hit the searchers first. It wasn't the metallic tang of a battlefield or the thick incense of a cathedral. It was something else entirely. Cloying, sweet, patient. The kind of smell that doesn't announce itself all at once, but seeps into the back of your throat until your body understands what your mind refuses to accept. It was the stench of rot, coming from inside a velvet-lined chest in the Marshal's private chambers. The men who opened that chest were soldiers. They had seen war. They had walked through villages burned to ash and stepped over men who had been opened by steel. But what they found inside that chest didn't just end a career. It shattered the soul of France. And here is the first thing you need to understand. Nobody was supposed to look inside that room. For nearly a decade, the most powerful man in France had walked past that door every single day. And the world had let him, because he was a hero, because he wore the cross, because the system that should have protected the innocent had, quietly and completely, protected him instead. In the history of human depravity, we often talk about Tamerlane, the conqueror who built towers of skulls across Central Asia, or the cold paranoia of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who buried scholars alive to silence dissent. But as I teased in our last investigation, there is a name that makes even Tamerlane look merciful. Name that sits at the outermost edge of recorded human cruelty, and yet begins not in a dungeon, but on a battlefield soaked in glory. His name was Gilles de Rais. To the public, to the world, he was the Marshal of France, a legendary war hero who stood shoulder to shoulder with Joan of Arc to save an entire nation from English occupation. He was the wealthiest man in Europe, a patron of the arts, a collector of manuscripts and sacred music, and a devout protector of the church. Men envied him, women revered him, kings rewarded him, poets celebrated him. But beneath the polished steel of his armor lay a psychological architecture so twisted, so deliberately constructed, that it defies easy comprehension. Because understanding Gilles de Rais is not simply a matter of cataloguing atrocities, it requires us to ask a harder question, one we would rather not answer. Does a civilization produce a man like this? And how does it look the other way while he operates? In the next 20 minutes, we are stripping away the sanitized legends to reveal the Monster of Tiffauges. You are going to discover how a hero of the realm became history's most prolific child killer, and why the very system meant to protect the innocent was used, with full awareness, to facilitate a decade of slaughter. This is a story of absolute power and absolute depravity, and it is not as far from our world as we would like to believe. To understand the monster, we must first look at the hero. And the hero was, by every measurable standard, extraordinary. Born in 1405 into two of the most powerful dynasties in France, the de Rais line on one side and the de Craon line on the other, Gilles did not simply inherit land, he inherited a landscape screaming with violence. Feudal France in the early 1500s was not a civilization at peace with itself. It was a country of competing loyalties, endemic brutality, and a nobly born class that operated by a completely separate moral code from the peasants who worked its fields and filled its armies. Violence wasn't just permitted for men of his station. It was expected, admired, celebrated in the chansons and the chivalric romances that filled the libraries of the great castles. By his early 20s, Gilles de Rais was already a military prodigy. He had fought under multiple commanders, absorbed tactics with the speed of a man born to war, and built a reputation for ferocity that made his enemies hesitate and his allies feel invincible. When a peasant girl from Domremy, a girl named Joan of Arc who claimed to hear the voices of saints, arrived at the French court and somehow convinced the Dauphin to give her an army, it was Gilles who was appointed as her principal military protector, not because anyone around him was particularly devout, but because he was the best, the most capable, the most dangerous man in the room. He was her shield-bearer during the siege of Orléans, the moment that turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. He rode beside her during the liberation campaign that followed. He stood near enough to feel the heat when she was chained to a post, and the smoke began to rise. He watched her burn, and for his service through all of it, the battles, the sieges, the strategic brilliance, the sheer terrifying momentum of a campaign that had no right to succeed, the King of France awarded him the highest military honor the country could bestow, Marshal of France. The man we are about to describe, the man whose private chambers contained that velvet-lined chest, was once considered the most holy defender of the French crown, the golden boy of the 15th century, man whose name was spoken with reverence in the same breath as saints and kings. But like Robespierre, the incorruptible lawyer who became the architect of the terror, who sent thousands to the guillotine in the name of virtue, Gilles' immaculate public image was a mask worn over a wound that had never been treated. The longer the mask stayed on, the more infected the wound became. Why does a hero turn into a predator? The question sounds rhetorical, but it isn't. There is always a mechanism, there is always a door that opened at precisely the wrong time, in precisely the wrong direction. Like Vlad III of Wallachia, whom we explored in a previous chapter, Gilles' childhood was a form of psychological imprisonment. His parents died when he was 10 years old. A father killed by a boar, a mother gone to illness. Within the same year, and he was delivered into the hands of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, a man of monstrous political ambition and almost no parental warmth. De Craon did not grieve his daughter's death. He calculated its implications. He looked at the boy standing before him and saw not a grieving child, but a property portfolio, a dynastic chess piece with a heartbeat. Gilles was educated brilliantly. Latin, theology, military theory, music, illuminated manuscripts, the full architecture of medieval aristocratic culture, but educated in the service of his grandfather's ambitions, not his own personhood. He was given wealth without limit and authority without oversight, before he had ever developed the internal conscience that makes authority bearable for the people around it. And he discovered what powerful men always eventually discover. The rules stop applying not because anyone removes them, but because everyone around you stops enforcing them. Because the cost of confronting you is higher than the cost of looking away, he spent his fortune with the recklessness of a man who believes it is infinite. Theatrical productions so elaborate they beggared small nations. A private chapel staffed with dozens of clergy maintained at staggering cost purely for the pleasure of the music. Alchemy, feasting, pageantry. He consumed money the way a fire consumes a forest, without calculation, without the awareness that forests have edges. As the gold disappeared, something else appeared in its place. When the treasury emptied, Gilles turned to alchemy. In the intellectual landscape of 15th century France, alchemy occupied a gray zone between natural philosophy, forbidden theology, and outright black magic. And Gilles moved through all three zones with accelerating speed. He hired mystics. He brought sorcerers into his household. He made contact with a Florentine invoker named Francesco Prelati, a man who claimed the ability to summon demonic entities and direct their power toward practical ends. But the trial testimony would later reveal, in accounts so graphic that medieval scribes hesitated to commit them to permanent ink, that the descent into alchemy and the descent into violence were not two separate stories. They were the same story. The demonology gave the violence a frame, metaphysical permission slip. If the blood of the innocent was a substance with cosmic properties, then what Gilles was doing wasn't depravity. It was practice. It was research. This is the transition point that separates Gilles de Rais from the merely violent men of his era. He did not simply lose control. He built a system. He moved from bankrupt noble to artist of suffering with the same methodical intelligence he had once applied to military campaigns. And he began with the most vulnerable population in his world, the invisible people, the children of peasants, the beggars at the castle gate, the ones whose disappearances would be mourned in silence because the families mourning them had no voice, no access, and no recourse against the Marshal of France. For nearly 10 years, Gilles de Rais operated with near total impunity across his network of castles and estates. The primary killing grounds were Machecoul and Tiffauges, fortresses built for war, repurposed for something that has no polite name. He would send his servants, his inner circle of trusted accomplices, out into the surrounding countryside to find children, boys primarily, between the ages of 6 and 18. They were brought to the castles under various pretexts: promises of employment, offers of food, the simple and devastating authority of a nobleman's word. They were brought in through gates that closed behind them, and they never came out. Imagine being a mother in a village under Gilles' jurisdiction. Your child disappears, not snatched in the night, simply gone. The way children sometimes go, in a world without records, without systems of accountability, without any mechanism for a peasant woman to demand answers from the man who owns the road she walks on. You go to the castle, you ask, you beg perhaps at the outer gate, and somewhere inside those walls, the Marshal of France is listening. Not to help you, not with guilt or discomfort or the smallest shadow of remorse. He is listening the way a collector listens to music he composed himself. The details recorded in the later trial proceedings are among the most disturbing documents in the medieval legal archive. Gilles did not kill in chaos. He did not kill in passion. He presided. He sat at a table. He kept records. He developed preferences and aesthetics. He would toast the dying as if raising a cup at a feast. He innovated. He refined. He discussed the results afterward with his household staff, men who, we must not forget, continued to serve him, continued to carry out his instructions, continued to function as the administrative infrastructure of a decade of horror. We tend to imagine monsters as raving, visibly broken, easily identified. Gilles de Rais was none of those things. He was articulate and charming in company. He was generous to the church, genuinely, extravagantly generous. He was intellectually curious. He was, by almost every social measure available to his contemporaries, a man of culture and distinction. And that is precisely why he survived for so long. Because the people around him had every incentive to believe the public performance, and almost none to investigate what lay beneath it. His downfall, when it finally came, had almost nothing to do with the children. Gilles made a catastrophic political miscalculation. During a property dispute with a local lord named Geoffrey Le Ferron, he forced his way into a church during a religious ceremony, seized Le Ferron's brother, a cleric, and held him by force. In 15th century France, this was not merely a rude gesture. It was a direct assault on the body of the church. It was the kind of act that could not be quietly absorbed into the ongoing calculus of accommodation that had protected Gilles for a decade. The Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit, had almost certainly been aware that something was wrong in the Tiffauges region for years. The disappearances were not invisible. They were simply inconvenient, and Gilles had been too powerful, too useful, too connected to the nobility and to the crown to make an investigation worth the political cost. But the assault on the cleric changed the arithmetic. Suddenly, the cost of not acting exceeded the cost of acting. The machinery of institutional power, which had stood by and let it happen, finally turned. When investigators entered the castles, what they found had been largely destroyed. Gilles had months of warning and used them to erase what he could. But you cannot erase everything, not a decade of it. The evidence that remained confirmed what the surrounding villages had been whispering, in terror and without any hope of being believed. For years, under the inquisitorial system of medieval justice, where confession was considered the queen of all proofs, Gilles de Rais did not merely confess, he performed. He wept in the courtroom, not for the children, but with the theatrical grief of a man finally given an audience worthy of his story. He provided details his interrogators had not asked for. He described his crimes with the precision of a craftsman reviewing his work. He was sentenced to death. But in one final breathtaking piece of state theater, his noble rank purchased him a final mercy. He would not burn alive. He would be strangled first, killed cleanly before the fire was lit, a privilege extended only to men of his station. Even at the very end, the machinery of aristocratic privilege performed its function. Even here, the system found a way to distinguish between Gilles de Rais and the people he had destroyed. And here is the most horrifying truth that the story of Gilles de Rais leaves us with. We want him to be an outlier. We want the story to end with the conclusion that he was a singular aberration, a rabid animal who happened to wear a marshal's tabard, because that conclusion is comfortable. It places him outside the system rather than inside it. It lets the system off the hook. But the evidence will not support that comfort. Gilles de Rais was not produced by madness alone. He was produced by a civilization that handed absolute power to damaged people and then built elaborate cultural machinery to protect them from accountability. He was literate and cultured because the culture invested in him. He was untouchable for a decade because the institutions around him, the church, the nobility, the crown, calculated that the cost of touching him was too high. He was finally prosecuted, not because a peasant child's life mattered enough to trigger the machinery of justice, but because he had the arrogance to offend a clergyman. The children he killed were invisible to the system while he lived. They remain, in most accounts, nameless even now. He was the hero we applauded while ignoring the screaming forests at his feet. The lesson his story forces us to hold, uncomfortable, resistant to easy resolution, is this. Ultimate cruelty does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fangs showing and fire in its eyes. It arrives wearing the most sacred symbols available to it. The cross, the crown, the title earned in genuine blood on a genuine battlefield. It arrives as the man everyone trusts, performing exactly the role everyone needs him to perform, until the day the chest is finally opened and the smell fills the room. Gilles de Rais built a throne of skulls and called it his divine right. He proved that monsters do not require supernatural origin stories. They require only two things: power and a damaged soul that was never given the chance to heal. He was the Golden Knight who became a demon in plain sight, and his story is not safely sealed behind the glass of medieval history. It is a mirror. What it reflects is the question we are always slowest to ask. Not how could one man do this, but how many people had to look away for him to keep doing it. That question has no comfortable answer, but it is the only one worth sitting with. If this journey into the unsanitized reality of history's most famous hero-turned-monster gave you a new perspective, hit the subscribe button. Every week, we uncover the suppressed truths that textbooks and Hollywood cleaned up, the real people, the real systems, and the real darkness that the official histories preferred you never examined too closely.